What now for peace in Colombia? Its last remaining rebel group is blamed for the police academy bomb blast in Bogota. How does the attack threaten the fragile stability following half a century of conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. It's the deadliest attack in Colombia for 15 years. Thursday's car bomb blast in Bogota killed 20 people and injured dozens in a police academy. President Ivan Duque is blaming Colombia's last remaining rebel group, the ELN, and his renewed arrest orders for commanders who've been in Cuba for peace talks.
Basta ya, señores del ELN.
No more ELN, no more deaths, no more kidnappings and attacks on the environment. Colombia says no more. 247 kidnapped every year, and about 2 people every 3 days. The ELN is and has been a criminal machine of kidnappings and attacks.
Para toda Colombia hoy,
today, for all of Colombia, it is clear that the ELN has no genuine will for peace.
Al Jazeera's Alessandro Rampietti is following events in Bogota.
President Ivan Duque addressed the nation late on Friday, essentially doing what everybody was expecting, ending the possibility of a reactivation of peace negotiations with the ELN, the last active rebel group in Colombia. That happened after the government announced that the ELN was behind the car bomb attack that killed 20 young cadets on Thursday here in the capital, Bogota. Duque said that no ideology, no political fight can justify the horror that Colombians had to endure. He announced that he will reactivate the international arrest warrant of the ELN leadership who is in Cuba, and they were expecting the restart of these peace negotiations. For many here, Duque had no other option after this attack on Thursday, and this means that Colombia will not have the possibility, at least for now, to reach a complete peace, something that most Colombians hoped could happen after the largest rebel group in the country, the FARC, had signed an agreement with the Colombian government back in 2016.
More background now on the National Liberation Army, widely known as the ELN. It's Colombia's last remaining active group of around 2,000 rebels. The left-wing armed group was founded in 1964 by Roman Catholic priests and students, inspired by the Cuban Revolution and Marxist ideology. Their armed struggle is for a popular democracy and equal distribution of land and wealth. Their activities include kidnappings, cocaine trafficking, blowing up oil pipelines, and attacking multinational companies. Both the US and EU consider the ELN a terrorist organization. Now, ELN began formal talks with the Colombian government in 2016 after then-President Juan Manuel Santos signed a landmark peace deal with the largest rebel group, the FARC. The ELN's first temporary ceasefire was in October 2017 after more than 50 years of conflict. The group resumed attacks a year ago when the 101-day ceasefire agreement expired and leaders demanded a new deal. Peace talks resumed last May, first in Ecuador, then in Cuba, but were suspended in September when the new president, Ivan Duque, dissolved the government's negotiation team in Havana and demanded the ELN stop all criminal activities. Let's bring in our panel now. Joining us from Bogota is Jorge Restrepo, Director of CERAC, a conflict analysis research center. In Barcelona, Spain, we're joined on Skype by Kristian Herbolzheimer, Director of the International Catalan Institute for Peace, and also in Bogota, Colombia, Arlene Tickner, Professor of International Relations at Universidad del Rosario. Thank you all for joining us on Inside Story. Thank you so much for your time. Jorge Restrepo in Bogota, if I can start with you. Does this attack indeed bear the hallmarks of ELN? And if it does, what message are they sending the Colombian government?
Well, first, yes, it does bear the marks of the ELN. That's the way they have operated in the past in their terrorist attacks. The most recent one happened in Barranquilla, and it was very similar, despite some minor differences. They usually proceed in that way, attacking that type of targets. But most important probably is the fact that there is sufficient evidence, in my view, brought forward by the Colombian prosecutors' offices that provide credibility to the accusation that they did against the ELN leadership. The other point, in terms of the message, it's basically a message that we do not know if it is of the entire ELN group, which is a federated, quite a non-cohesive group in terms of decision-taking ways. And that message is, at least from one part of that group, that they are withdrawing the support for the ELN to negotiate to the government an end to the conflict that they have going on for the past 52 years with the government of Colombia.
Interesting. Jorge, the target, the General Santander Police Academy, is supposed to be one of Bogota's most protected installations. What does the fact that they were able to target this military academy say about their strength? And also, what does it say about the government's, the authorities' level of preparedness?
Well, one has to say that it is very difficult to have complete protection against a terrorist attack. I mean, it's very difficult to have, complete invulnerability to this type of attack. Second, this was a center of studies. It was actually not a military but a civilian place, in the sense that the police is a civilian institution in Colombia. Of course, there were armed guards and there was protection, but this is not a place where police operations are routinely carried out. There is not a storage of guns or explosives. It is not as well guarded as other police installations. This, after all, is a university center where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of students preparing for their careers in terms of police officers. And that's why there were, by the way, so many foreigners that were studying from Ecuador, Central America, in this academy.
All right. Arlene, in Bogota, Ivan Duque was elected Colombia's president on a law and order platform, I should say, but he somewhat moderated once he took office. Do you think this attack will change his course? How do you see the government responding in the short and in the long term?
I see the government returning to a hard-handed strategy, unfortunately. This was Duque's promise, as you mentioned, and he had attempted to strike a more conciliatory tone and to take a middle road, not rejecting completely the peace processes, but also not buying into them completely, as Juan Manuel Santos, the previous president, has been accused of doing so. Given the new military and police leadership that Duque has appointed at the end of last year, and given this event and his announcement that he's going to end any possibility in the near future of talks with the ELN, I think that what we can expect is a return to more violence, a more militarized strategy.
But
and this will have serious
short on shutting the door entirely on negotiations, did he not?
He has offered to keep the door open if the ELN establishes certain conditions, such as freeing all kidnapping victims and ceasing their criminal activities related to terrorist attacks, narco trafficking, etc. But these are conditions that he had laid out at the very beginning of his government, and it's difficult to envision the ELN actually complying.
All right, let's bring in Kristian into the conversation. Kristian, in Barcelona, in the last 2 decades, you were recently in Colombia. In the last 2 decades, the ELN has never been capable or shown much interest in carrying out high-profile acts of violence. What does this attack, if they are indeed behind it, suggest about their capabilities and their intentions?
Well, indeed, this is surprising in terms of the impact the attack has had. However, I would echo the words of Jorge Restrepo that the ELN guerrilla is not a cohesive group. It's a federation with different commanders. And I wouldn't be surprised if this wasn't something that had been agreed by the full structure. But if it is confirmed that the ELN is behind it, it's probably a faction of the ELN. And I wouldn't be surprised if this then would trigger severe internal discussions because I'm pretty sure not everybody inside the organization agrees with it.
It's interesting that you say they're not a cohesive group. It was expected that they would fill the vacuum left by the FARC after the FARC signed a peace agreement with the government in 2016. But they haven't done that. Is that the case?
Oh, yes, they have indeed done it. But what the security situation in Colombia after the peace agreement with FARC, which was the main rebel group and was signed a couple of years ago, is that you still have a left-wing, politically motivated armed group like the ELN, but since quite a long time ago, colluding with mere criminal activity. So there's a struggle inside the organization between those who will still stick to the political line and the other ones who are increasingly having the upper hand because they have more money and more power, who are more linked to a way of living in the criminal activity sphere.
Interesting. Jorge, in Bogota, I really want to know about the strength of the group today. Did they absorb the FARC's illegal economies and territorial control? It was, again, as I say, expected that they would fill that gap, they would fill that vacuum. But what happened in your view?
They do not have the capacity to fill the vacuum, the spaces that the FARC left, nor to be able to capture the rents from criminal activities that the FARC were producing, the illegal rent, the illegal funds. The ELN is currently in at least 5 areas in the country. They did try to expand to several of those areas, but one has to remember that in most areas or regions where the ELN is, they are facing criminal organizations that are also disputing those illegal rents, illegal funds with them. Then they have not been relatively successful, and that is important because it explains 2 things. One, that the higher risk that they are posing now with this terrorist campaign after the ending of the peace negotiations that was decreed by Ivan Duque yesterday, it is higher risk but is localized. And second, that it will be very difficult to defeat them because they are in regions which are far away, distant, very difficult geographically, and those regions have very complicated situation in terms of security, not only because of the presence of the ELN, but because of the presence of other criminal groups disputing those rents with them.
Arlene, Jorge says very difficult to defeat the ELN. This is no doubt President Duque's first big test. How much confidence is there? How much confidence do Colombians have in his ability to tackle this security threat?
I think the levels of confidence are quite low. If we look at Duque's polling, he's polling tremendously low. He does not project authority in many realms, including security. And I think it remains to be seen if the new military and police leadership is capable of filling this void in security. But what we're seeing are increases in attacks and killings of social leaders, increases in homicides and other manifestations of violence and insecurity in the country. So I would say that the objective is quite difficult to comply with right now.
And Colombians, of course, Arlene, were deeply polarized over the issue of peace with the FARC. There were many problems, and there are still many problems in implementing that deal. Do you think there can be a similar deal with the ELN?
The ELN, as my colleagues have explained, is a completely different organization. Indeed, the negotiations that had taken place with the group had proceeded along a very different track. Most importantly, the ELN insists that any agreement has to be the result of consultations with civil society, which is something that the FARC had not demanded. And this is a very difficult act to conduct. And so proceeding and getting them to lay down their arms even is a very difficult challenge that the government now faces.
All right. Kristian, in Barcelona. You're in Spain, and the ELN's leader, Pablo Beltran, has drawn comparisons between the ELN and the Basque separatist group ETA. We know that Pedro Sanchez, when he was visiting the region just a few months ago, offered Spain support to reach, some sort of agreement because of Spain's experience with ETA. Can a comparison be drawn between ETA and the ELN, and can a similar agreement be reached?
I don't think so. In terms of the nature of the group or the design of the peace process. Spain has not been a major player in the peace process in Colombia or elsewhere in the world over the past 10, 15 years, I would say, unlike before when they had been very active in Central America. And one of the reasons is because of the hardline policy in Spain against the Basque ETA group. And essentially the message was, we don't talk to terrorists. Now ELN and most armed groups around the world are listed as terrorist organizations, and therefore if the public policies we don't engage with terrorists, then it's very difficult for Spain to play any role. Now, where I do see a very interesting analogy is the following. The armed conflict in the Basque Country did not terminate through a peace agreement or peace negotiations. What happened is that after ETA, the armed group, put a bomb at the airport in Madrid, that has such a huge impact on society and such a harsh reaction, not only from society at large, but even from their own constituency, that it became the last act of ETA, because they clearly saw there was no future in continuing with a violent struggle. I don't want to make wishful thinking, but I do think that if it's confirmed that it is ELN who is behind this attack, I would envision that's the end of their political future. And in any case, of course, that doesn't mean it's the end of the organization. There needs to be some sort of transition, but unlikely through formal negotiations with the government, and possibly there will have to be new venues of conversations to pave the way for the ELN to disband. And that is something that happened in the Basque Country under the leadership of civil society. Right. So we'll see if that is a track that will follow.
Jorge, in Bogota, your thoughts on this? Kristian says this could mark the end of the ELN as a political organization. Do you agree with that? And also, I'm curious about the regional implications. ELN leadership is in Venezuela. They have some support there. What implications regionally?
I mean, I do believe that the ELN will use these. On the contrary, as Kristian, I do believe that they are going to use these, the end of these negotiations, to reinvent itself. And sadly, the strongest of their factions, which is the Eastern Bloc, which is actually close to the border with Venezuela, is going to impose the agenda on the rest of the ELN in order to transform itself in a much more radical organization that will base their armed violence in terrorist attacks. I envision an increase in urban guerrilla warfare, but basically not urban guerrilla warfare, but most likely urban terrorist attacks, and also an increase against the economic infrastructure, in particular against oil pipelines. This is a sad moment in Colombian history, because what we are seeing now is that there is somehow a consensus in Colombian society that we need to close the door to end the conflict with the ELN through a negotiation, and that's bad news, really bad news.
But also the underdevelopment of rural areas, the poverty and inequality in some parts of Colombia has been fertile ground for these rebel groups, for the FARC, for the ELN. Has that been addressed? The 2016 peace deal didn't address that. Does this new president have a plan to address that issue?
I mean, let me put it this way. Colombia has seen an incredible transformation for the good in terms of reducing poverty, in terms of reducing inequality and providing public services. But it's not sufficient enough to finish up these good conditions for insurgency. Still, our levels of poverty are incredibly high, and we are still seeing what Arlene mentioned a moment ago, which is very high levels of what I call political violence against human rights defenders, social leaders, those that are seeking the restitution of their lands that have taken away by violence. We are still a very troubled society, a very conflictive society. And sadly, that also feeds the insurgency of the ELN.
Yeah. Arlene, your thoughts on this. What policies has the Duque government put in place to address the economic inequalities, the social inequalities in some of Colombia's neglected areas? And are they convincing enough?
I would say that he hasn't implemented many policies, and perhaps in his defense, Juan Manuel Santos was also not tremendously successful, the previous government, in addressing in particular inequality, which has not improved in Colombia. Colombia continues to be one of the most unequal countries in the world and one of the most unequal in Latin America. I think the greatest challenge that Duque faces, which is actually a historical challenge that Colombia has faced forever, is how to consolidate the state in a country in which regions are very important, in which enhancing a state presence, providing services, addressing poverty, inequality, lack of social services is something that no one has actually been successful in achieving.
All right, let me hear from you in Barcelona, Kristian. Ivan Duque promised to, of course, modify the 2016 peace deal with the FARC. Where does this attack leave that deal, and what now for peace in Colombia?
Well, as Arlene was saying earlier on, after taking office, he was moderating his discourse, and I think realizing the agreement with FARC is there to stay, and therefore adjusting the initial opposition to that agreement to probably continue the peace process and the implementation of the peace agreement. I think that is still very relevant. The big risk now is that in a polarized society, there will be a call for increased militarization and harsh repression against anything that may be linked to the ELN. Now, it is important to consider, as has been said as well, there is already serious human rights violations or attacks against human rights defenders, and an increased militarization of society may lead to also increased violence against people who may be tagged or labeled as being sympathizers of the ELN but have no link at all, and that is actually a very serious risk. So what I would hope is that Duque is able to play both the roles at the carrot and the stick, well, not the carrot and the stick, sorry, let's put it this way, hardline against any military attacks or terrorist attacks, but at the same time changes in public policy and increased protection for social leaders, because that at the end is also a way of taking the political discourse from the ELN away, if he's able to provide for the better for society at large and not only for the elite.
All right, Jorge in Bogota, I'll give you the last word. What now for peace in Colombia, and what implications also regionally? I asked you about Venezuela earlier, and also Cuba. The president is asking Cuba to arrest the ELN commanders who were there for peace talks. What implications regionally and also inside Colombia, of course?
Well, very serious in terms of those regional implications. I think this was a slap in the face to the Cuban government that has been quite supporting of the Colombian initiatives to achieve peace through a negotiation. It was, I will say, I'm not an expert in international relations, but it was quite a shambles. And the way that the government of Colombia conducted the communication and the dealing with this with the Cuban government has been tremendously wrong and cumbersome. But apart from that, I will say that the Colombian implementation of peace, the peace-building component, will be very difficult, and especially because of the Duque government, although compliance with the part of the implementation in terms of reintegration, providing the funds regional development, it is against this agreement and will push the FARC strongly in order to comply to the requirements in terms of transitional justice. We will have difficult times in terms of peace implementation, but I still have faith in that this agreement will support those attacks, indeed by the government itself as well, and we will see that this agreement will sustain the future. It will be a sustainable agreement, in my view.
uncertain times ahead for Colombia. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Jorge Restrepo, Kristian, Herbolzheimer, and Arlene Tickner. Thank you. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.